The Wednesday, July 2nd MetroVision Issues Committee meeting. We're going to begin with public comment. If there's anybody in the comment that would like to speak to us for up to 3 minutes on an issue we haven't already covered, you are welcome to do so now. Do we have any takers? Going once, going twice. No public comment. Okay. Then let me draw your attention to that's exactly like Boulder, just dead silence. The summary of the June 4th meeting. We don't have to approve these minutes, but did anybody have any edits or comments? Seeing none, we will move on to our action items, beginning with number 4, which is moving to designate Regional Transportation Committee members. As you read in your staff memo, DRCOG has 5 different positions on the Regional Transportation Committee. That's Jennifer, the chair of the board, the vice chair, and then 2 members from MVIC. In addition to those 5 designated slots, we have at least 4 alternates, and we can have as many alternates as we like, who can fill in when those 5 members can't be present. So at the last meeting, we asked for people to indicate an interest in serving on this esteemed board, and we heard from Ron Wachowski, George Teal, Robin Kinich, and Herb Atchison. I've also since then been contacted by 3 different board members who also are interested, and that's Shakti, Doug Tisdale, and Sue Horn. So at this point, let me open it up to see if there's any additional people that would like an opportunity to participate on the RTC, because as we said, we can have as many alternates as we'd like. Is there anybody else interested? Bill.
I move that we designate Ron Wachowski and Robin Kinich as the 2 MVIC designated members and name the others, George Teal, Herb Atchison, Shakti, Sue Horn, and myself as the alternates.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We have our RTC members. Congratulations. There we go.
And I move that the alternates serve in the alphabetical order in which they're listed.
Oh, no. I disagree.
Yeah, and I'm not hearing a second for that motion, so I will keep moving. Was there a note about the meeting time that you wanted to?
We learned yesterday that for the July RTC meeting, which is the Tuesday immediately prior to the Wednesday board meeting, DRCOG board meeting, the transportation commissioners have a conflict and have asked us to try to find a way to move that meeting. So we're looking at July 22nd to have that meeting. So that is taking this kind of out of order. So those of you who just had your name thrown into the RTC pool, whether you're a member or alternate, that next meeting, right now at least, we're planning on July 22nd to accommodate the transportation commissioners. Unless you hear otherwise, every other meeting will be on the Tuesday immediately before the 3rd Wednesday. And I say it that way because it's not the 3rd Wednesday and the 3rd Tuesday are not necessarily in the same week in some months. So that's why I'm wording it in that fashion. There you go. So congratulations to you all. Let me just say too, with regard to alternates, when we need an alternate for RTC, we know we need someone a day or two ahead of time. We make phone calls to the people who are closest to the DRCOG offices, as opposed to calling just anyone and everyone, so that you're not driving down here from let's say, just for the sake of example, Nederland, for a meeting that may last less than 45 minutes. So we always try to find those of you who are closer in to attend these meetings when we need an alternate.
Any questions about that? All right, then moving along, we'll go to number 5, which is a continuation of our work on the TIP. And we have 2 outstanding issues on that. The first is the person hours traveled calculation, and then the second is the Phase 1 funding targets. And just to help us frame up issue number 1 before Doug gives us a staff presentation, you'll recall we discussed this briefly at the last minute, and it was the pleasure of the MVEC board to postpone a decision until we had additional information from the staff, which we'll receive shortly. And the impetus for changing the personal hours traveled item was really updating the calculation, or methodology, if you will, to make it more accurate, to reflect what's happening on our roadways. Right now, the calculation we use is to treat cars and buses as if they were carrying the same number of people, which doesn't tell the full mobility calculation that we're trying to get to in terms of people moved or people delayed. And so the proposal had been made to the TAC and supported by the TAC to update our methodology to make it more accurate. So with that, let me turn it over to Doug, who's going to lead us through a wonky spreadsheet and show us how it works.
Great, thank you very much. But before I begin that, I would like to just share with you a little snippet of an event that I attended last Friday. For those of you who don't, I'm sure you all know that Canada Day was yesterday, and there was an event that was held last Friday, hosted by the Canada-Colorado Association. Those of you who don't know, I was born and raised in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada, so I was sent an email from Jennifer, and I was reading down through at the event, and special guest, Mayor Doug Tisdale from Cherry Hills Village. And I was like, are you kidding me? There is no way I'm going to miss this, because I can tell you what, if Doug's there, there's going to be some singing. So and dancing.
Canadian
So
invasion would mean to Colorado.
Oh shoot.
Now to do this, you have to picture me dressed in full Monty.
So this is just a little snippet.
Invasion would mean to Colorado. Now to do this, you have to picture me dressed in full Monty regalia when I was playing as my role as Lieutenant Dudley Mackenzie McDowell Preston Do-Right, and I announced to the audience that the Canadians were taking over, and I said at the end of it, Canada, Canada, Saskatoon and Ottawa, soon your state will by law be a part of Canada. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
I had to share that because he did a fantastic job, and I'll tell you, after the time, I was like, I know that guy. I know that guy. No.
Although the actual Dean Doolittle has talked about initiating some sort of defamation charge.
Oh, very funny. That's excellent. Well, anyway, back to the serious work, and we are very close, as Chairperson Lisa mentioned, we're very close to wrapping this up. We do have 2 outstanding items. One is the delay reduction as it relates to the roadway operational project, and the first phase funding targets. So, but I will note just 2 things, just to make sure everybody understands. I mentioned this last time, and I want to mention it again, that the action that you ultimately take before the call for projects will not include 2 things. It will not include any discussion or information in the document about second phase selection. That information is really not necessary for the call for projects, and we really do need to get that call out. So what we're planning to do is, once the call is out, we're going to meet back as early as August to begin those discussions about the whole second phase selection process. And Appendix C, you'll notice it's vacant right now, and that's simply because there has not been board action on the 2040 RTP regionally funded roadway projects. And once we do have that action, those will be included in the document, but obviously that has to be completed before the call can be done. And we anticipate, fingers crossed, that we can get that call out by the end of July. So then, let's talk about delay reduction. I'm just going to flip through here real quick and grab a table. Oh, wow, that's not very clear, is it? All right. So, yeah, it's in your packet. Let me just say this real quick. Well, what we did at the last meeting, you'll recall that we provided for your consideration, which was a recommendation of TAC, to include this new formula for delay reduction in just operational roadway projects. And what it was basically using person hours traveled versus vehicle hours traveled. And at the last meeting, we had a pretty good discussion about that. And what you asked for was us to provide some examples to show kind of the sensitivity of that calculation to the ultimate project scores. And now this table that you have here, that's on the screen, is this is the one that was sent to you this morning. There was 3 additional rows that were added. We stopped in the original packet with just providing the total reduction in PHT score. And thank you, Mayor Kathy Noon, for suggesting that we also include what the ultimate project scores would be with and without the transit average vehicle occupancy. So what I thought I might do, does everybody have a copy of the new table? If not, we do have additional. Okay. No.
It's in the link of the email you got today.
It's the email that was sent out this morning.
Yeah.
Morning's email.
Yeah.
Is the right one.
Okay. So what I thought I would do, so we have 6 examples, 2 of which we made some assumptions because we didn't have perfect information, particularly on the VHT information. But I will run through the first 4 first. And these are real projects. These are projects that were submitted as part of the tip call in the last go-around. And you'll see in the first row the total reduction in VHT. What that is it's basically a calculated number. We know, and we get this from you guys, from your technical staff as part of our call. For example, an operational project, let's say it's an intersection improvement, which 1 or 2 of these are. Let's just say that the improvement was the addition of double left turn lanes, for example. Well, we know what the baseline condition is before that improvement. We know what the level of service is, turning movements, and all that information. And they're able to calculate what the delay is in vehicle hours of travel. They do a simulation in highway capacity software or CoreSim, Synchro, or something in order to simulate what the improvement would be, in vehicle hours of travel. So this number is basically what that is. So on the first example, the Foothills Parkway project, that 94.1 is what is believed to will be the reduction in vehicle hours travel because of that improvement. And then the second row is the regional average vehicle occupancy rate of all vehicle types is 1.36. So we use that as kind of the default or standard across all categories. The max load, now we get into the transit element of this calculation. The max load is basically the maximum number of passengers that are on a bus at any given time. And for our purposes, that any given time is during the peak hour. And it's a combination of the AM and PM peaks. And then there's a calculation that's done based on the total max load as well as the number of buses that traverse that corridor or that project location during the peak hours. and we come up with an average vehicle occupancy, which includes both cars and buses. And in this first example, you can see is 1.44, which is higher than the 1.36 regional average. So now, in order to come up with this total reduction in person hours traveled, it's just a simple multiplication of the 94.1 times the 1.44. And for this project, we get rounded 135. And you can see how that compares to the other three projects here. It is by far the largest, and that's primarily because of the total reduction in VHT was the primary reason. You can see in these, we tried to find examples that showed the highs and lows. Quite frankly, it wasn't the easiest thing to do based on the information we had, but you can see that that the average vehicle occupancy for the first two is 1.4-ish. That's pretty normal for transit corridors, I would suggest. Corridors with transit. You can see the other two did not have transit, so you're able to compare corridors that had transit versus those that did not. And just to look at the the highest transit corridors in the region, we looked at Colfax at 2 locations, we knew what the max load was on those corridors, and we were able to calculate what the average vehicle occupancy, including transit, was. And you can see 2.02, which is, I think, is probably, most would agree, is probably the highest transit within our region, or pretty darn close. So if you bring this down to below the double line here to the 3 new rows that we have, we projected this out, what the number of points would be for delay reduction based on if you included the transit average vehicle occupancy rate information, the 1.44, versus if you just used the the regional average one. And you can see that it's really, it does provide additional point or two for corridors or projects that have transit that are, in this case, ones that are around 1.44 or so. But I wouldn't say it's overly sensitive to it. You can see the first 2 examples, the difference was 1 point, and the last 2 was 0 because, of course, there was no transit on those corridors, so there was no difference. But for the other 2 locations, you see we did make some assumptions. The 94.1 total reduction in VHT, we just took that from what was used in the first example, and it's probably a little higher than average as far as what we've seen we saw in the last tip, but we thought it was a pretty good estimate to use, a good proxy to use. And you can see based on this that the total points that would be received out of a possible 18 for this project would be 17. So the highest transit corridor in the region, as you would probably suspect, does extremely well in this category. It's basically a difference of 6 points that if we were to include it. I know that was a lot of information. Talked a lot. I'd be happy to take any questions or comments regarding this.
Any questions? Kathy?
So my understanding is from what you said that we're using the total maximum bus transit load. So that's whether the seat's filled or not.
Right.
We're not going to ask them for some data to see if those seats are actually being used.
Well, no, this is actual data from RTD. They're able to provide us with the max load, what the total number of passengers on.
Okay, but you had originally said the number of seats, which is different than the number of passengers. So that's why I was trying to clarify. It is the number of passengers.
Definitely.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Any other questions, comments? If not, I'd be happy to entertain a motion.
Madam Chair, so moved.
I'm sorry?
So moved.
And I take so moved is adopting the person hours traveled methodology as proposed. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second. Any further discussion? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
Great. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair,
Let me get to...
point of
I'm
privilege.
sorry.
Before you move on to the second item, I would like to recognize the wise actions taken yesterday by the voters of the town of Bennett in rejecting a recall and keeping our one and only Sue Horn. Thank you,
Here,
Chair.
Hey. I was terribly remiss in not noting that at the beginning of the meeting. We celebrated that in the board officers meeting earlier.
It might not be as important here as it is in Bennett.
Those radicals in Bennett, I just don't know what to do about them. All right.
Great, boy. I don't know if I can top that. But let's go to first phase selection targets. And this is located on the red line version. I'm going to be making reference to the red line version for most of this. It's on page 23 of the red line version. We do have additional copies for those that don't have one. One down here. Well, we just briefly touched on this last month, and I think, you know, it's kind of a confusing topic, at least the way that it was done in the past. In my opinion, new guy here, I was always a little puzzled by, you know, the fact that we did this. We did the categories for first phase funding targets based on funding type, because as Mayor Cerna, well, I think it was Phil last month that mentioned that, you know, I don't really know what 60% of 75% is. It's kind of confusing to think about it in those terms, especially when you don't know the dollars involved with the first phase call. And I thought about that some, and it was something that I felt also. And I talked to Jennifer about it. And what we did, we actually went back to TAC and asked them to reevaluate exactly, you know, how we should show or illustrate this within the document. And what we proposed is to actually show this not by funding type, but actually by project type. And these are the 6 project types that we have listed within our documentation that we use for TIP call. So we had a good discussion about this at TAC, and so because really it's you know, while the color of money is certainly important, I think what people really want to know, and certainly I'm sure you guys want to know, is where exactly what share of the total pot of money is going to be allocated to what type of project. And after discussion at TAC, this is the recommendation that we came up with. It's basically roadway capacity projects at 38%, 22 for operational, reconstruction 15, 6, 3, and 16. You guys can read it obviously as well as I can. Just to give you some indication of what that means, and this is really up to date. Now I will say this $131 million, this is what, as of today, as we're sitting here today, what is available for that call for projects, or for first phase. It can change, it's pending. We're actually getting our what we call checkbook information from CDOT later on, probably next week. And it potentially could change, but it'll be around this. And I think that's also why it's important that we look at percentages versus the actual dollar value. But it will be ultimately around $131 million, which is available for first call. So this is what it looks like broken out by dollars. This is just a comparison. The first column that you see here, I guess the second column, is the current tip and what's been allocated by project type, and the new tip. And you can see all categories have gone up. That's due in part as a product of the fact that we have about $50 million more than we did last time. But you will see some categories, in particular, because of the percentages, are doing extremely well. In particular, I'll point out 2, and that's operational improvements. Because we changed basically the definition of operational projects, that we extended it. It used to be, is it 1,600 feet? 1,800 feet used to be the extension you can have from intersections. We now extended that to anything less than a mile. That we anticipate that we're going to have more operational projects this time than ever before. So we wanted to make sure that we're able to accommodate that. The other area I would like to point out is by PED, that that is basically is about 100% increase over what it was last time. And then we do know, and these numbers, we just didn't throw darts and end up with these numbers. These are really based on historical information we had and the number of projects we had and the number of total funding requests we've had. We know that bike ped projects are always maybe the most popular. I think we had 60 total submittals last time. So it was important to us as staff as well as TAC that we accommodate that accordingly. Oh. Last but not least, I know I show this flow chart every time, but I just wanted to point out, just so it's just a benchmark that you guys can look at, that all this information and the information that's included in these numbers, the new numbers, this includes the board action on the I-70 viaduct project. It takes into account that we're going to take $25 million off the top before the call for projects is conducted. And this flow chart illustrates that. You will see here it has the $25 million taken out of the other commitments before the call is done. And again, this is just to reiterate what was on a couple of the previous slides showing the percentages and what we believe will be, the estimate funding amounts. I will also point out, because I apologize, within the flow chart that was included in your packets, I actually had to remove this footnote in order to get the figure number at the top, but I forgot to take off the asterisk that was by the bike ped deal. But what that refers to, I just want to make everybody aware, and this is new, because the way the Transportation Alternatives Program works now, which was previously called the Transportation Enhancements Program, CDOT is doing their own separate call for projects, and we anticipate that there will be, based on our population within Region 1 and Region 4, that there will be approximately about $8 million available for that'll be eligible for projects within our region, and those are typically bike ped projects, trails projects, and the like. So I wanted to point that out too, because I think that's great news. It really gives us another pot that we can really go after. Again, if there's any questions on any of that, I'd be happy to try to answer.
So I have a comment, but let's ask any questions first. Phil?
Yes, Rex, just a follow-on. I don't know if Jennifer's had a chance to sit down with CDOT and have that conversation to see whether there would be some exchange with that $25 million going into I-70, if we could somehow get some not so federally string-attached dollars into the DRCOG pool.
Right, Mayor, I don't believe she has. I know her and Deb have talked. I know they talked after the meeting, the board meeting. So I can check on that. And we can talk about it after the meeting. But yes, I know we want to have that conversation certainly.
Kathy?
So I just want to make sure I understand. So since that footnote wasn't there, so the 21 million, and then there's an additional 8, or
That's
there's
correct.
8 of the 21. So
no, there's an additional.
So really, it's almost 30 million for bike ped.
Right, but I should note that is just an approximate, and other communities or other regions. I don't know how to say this. Other people outside of our member local governments are eligible for that money. Like, so areas outside of our MPO district within Region 1.
It's all $6.5 million is guaranteed.
Oh yeah, that's all Region 1. But yeah. But like in Region 4, we're Boulder and Boulder County in particular. We just took what our proportionate share could be. We could get more than that. We could get less than that. But we don't know.
So I guess that would have been good information to know, because maybe we would have had our percentages differently, because that really raises our bike ped. If capacity is one number, and we doubled bike ped, and now there's an additional funding source as well, then perhaps I still may not be in favor of that percentage any longer.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's no, I thought there was some reason. Okay, I was conversing with Steve because I thought something different, but it's 6.5 that's in the region is guaranteed for projects within our region, within Region 1.
Robin?
Can you clarify, because even though this chart puts all the money into a bucket and mushes it all together, there's still some compliance matching. So speak for a minute about the CMAQ consideration, for example, in terms of those dollars? So is it true that every penny that's going into bike ped could have gone somewhere else to roadway, or it might have had to stay in transit? I mean, just can you speak a little bit to the CMAQ sensitivity that this proposal has?
Yeah, very good. That is true. There is, when the two eligible pots of money we have are roadway capacity, Metro, STP Metro monies, which is very flexible. We can use that basically on anything. Then we have CMAQ monies, which congestion mitigation air quality funds, which is restricted. It's restricted primarily to, and traditionally we've always used that money on like transit-related stuff, air quality-related. Did I say I said transit, didn't I? We really haven't, at least in the last tip call, I don't know before that, we haven't used a lot of that money for bike ped projects, for example, which for first phase, yes, for first phase projects. We haven't used a lot of CMAQ money for bike ped, but this time we certainly are going to do that, as well as some roadway operational improvements that are eligible, and that's done throughout the country, that they use operational, that we traditionally have not done. So we anticipate that projects that are eligible for operational projects that are eligible for CMAQ, such as intersection improvements and the like, we would use at least a portion of CMAQ money on those projects. That answer it, Robin?
I would also note that what's not really captured in the Phase 1 numbers or percentages is the $25 million off the top to I-70, which is a great and laudable thing, but it's a road project. It's going to double the lane miles there. So in our thinking, if you're thinking about the percentage of dollars going to roads, you should add that in. We just decided as a body to take it off the top, but that doesn't mean it's not a roadway capacity enhancement and safety project. That. Yes, Mr. Tisdale.
A point of information, if I can just ask of Doug, please, and that is, your footnote says 8 million, and I'm sorry, I am confused. Is it 6.5 million or 8 million?
Well, 6.5 million of that has to be spent within Region 1.
Right.
ODOT Region 1, which is basically most of the DRCOG area. Right. The other 1.5 million or so, that was an estimated amount that we used. And how we came up with that is based on our proportionate share of the population of Region 4, which is Boulder County in our region, and then includes our neighbors to our north, outside of the DRCOG area. So we anticipate, I think, what was their share? 3 million-ish? What's the total for Region 4? You guys remember?
2 point something.
Yeah, 2 point something. So I think we took basically a third of that or whatever to project. I mean, that doesn't mean we're going to get that, but.
And the reason for the question is to get to some extent to Mayor Noon's question about how the percentages are impacted, because if the denominator goes from 131 million to 139 million, then there is an impact. There's, in effect, I suppose that's an extra, I'm going to say 3.7%, top of my head, that needs to get allocated out. But I think when you take into account that it's just 3.7% and you spread that over the balance, I don't think it actually impacts the percentages that significantly.
Right, right. And I should also note that, this is a separate call. This is an ODOT call that is really, my Lord. I
Embrace
apologize.
it. You live in Colorado
17
now.
years. DOT. Oklahoma it is. So I don't even know where I was going with that. But yes, I mean, it is a separate call. I mean, we just want to point out to show, like, there is certainly a commitment to bike ped projects. But I guess you can also say the same probably on the roadway side too, that there's pots of money over at CDOT that we use for state system projects. So,
Robin, you had your hand up, and then somebody else.
I'm like between two mics. Doug, you were actually going right where I was, which is, so does DRCOG control that asterisk?
They do not.
All right, so CDOT does. And
Correct.
so how is that different? Like, you could put an asterisk there for the ramp project, for example, as well, where
Right.
numerous projects in our region are being funded by ramp.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, so,
Yeah.
okay. So it's a little odd to include one
It
for
is.
one line item and not for others. It can kind of
Right.
Okay.
I agree with that.
Just wanted
but
to make sure I was understanding correctly that that is not something that this body will distribute, and it is analogous to RAMP or other programs where local projects went into a competitive
Yes,
realm.
yeah,
Okay.
and that's exactly right. And it's, you know, it was different in that we used to control that money, so where we don't now, but
Okay,
we thought
thank
we just
you.
pointed out.
It would have been safer without the asterisk.
Yes, you would have been.
Jackie?
I would like to make a motion that we approve the first phase total funding targets by project type that are listed.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Further discussion? All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Nay. Nay.
Why don't we get the nays? 3? 4? Wait. Were you, no? So,
I was helping kind.
do you need the,
I was acting as assistant parliamentarian on that.
so motion passes?
Okay, so now basically we're done with all the elements, at least as far as I know. We'd like ultimately to get your recommendation for approval of the entire document. So we can bring that forth to the board.
So moved.
We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
All right, so that takes us to our discussion on MetroVision 2040. And maybe I'll frame this up a little bit as well. We're going to have a brief board presentation, and then the action that's being asked tonight is a relatively simple, and I would argue benign, request to establish 2 committees to look at the information that DRCOG staff have collected, the stakeholder input studies and what have you, and decide what to do with that. So we've had some heated discussions on various aspects of this in the past related to funding. That isn't what we're being asked to decide tonight. We're just being asked whether or not we should establish a committee to discuss it further, and I would suggest that those of you who feel most passionate about this should think about volunteering if it is approved. So with that, let me turn it over to Steph.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good setup for me. I appreciate it. I did not think I'd have this much time. That went really fast. So I know. You know what I mean. I was over there thinking, all right, I got 30 more minutes before I have to be up here. So, but the chair did describe the action to you perfectly. What we're really asking you to do is to consider forming 2 ad hoc groups on 2 issues that have really come up kind of over and over and over again during the MetroVision 2040 process. The memo in front of you kind of lays out a few of sort of the key findings that have come out of both the regional housing strategy work and the regional economic strategy work, but I'm going to hit a little bit more highlights just to, and I agree, if this does feel like something you're interested in, I want you to see the types of issues that group is going to have to wrestle with. So a little bit as to where this came from. We're very fortunate for both of these efforts that we actually have funding from the Sustainable Communities Initiative grant that we received through HUD to actually provide resources to look at both of these issues. But in both cases, they were actually things that the board really gave us direction to work on. As the memo notes, in the current adopted strategic plan, it directs staff to think about these issues, to give the board information to figure out if and how these issues ought to be integrated into MetroVision 2040. And in both cases, during the board workshop held in 2013, when we talked about any number of issues that ought to be a focus of MetroVision 2040. We asked all of our communities to talk about what issues are going on locally and how do those bubble up to the regional level. And ultimately there were 5 things that people identified as key issues that are both local and regional, and housing was one of those issues, as was the idea of economic vitality or economic viability of this region. So a few notes on some of the things that came up in that housing conversation: just a lack of housing options in our communities, including an appropriate mix of rental product, outdated housing stock, which really is struggling to meet the needs of changing demographics. So that was really kind of the thing that, from the board perspective, back in, I guess, February of 2013, was what we heard is really key issues that we ought to be thinking about. For those that were on MVIC in June of last year, we actually brought you kind of an advanced version of where we thought this study was going to go to get some feedback, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And as I mentioned, we were fortunate to have funding through HUD to hire outside consultants to assist with that. So we did bring BBC Research and Consulting in to do a lot of the legwork on the regional housing strategy. So for those that were around this table in June of last year, I'm sure no one remembers this conversation other than me, but we had a conversation about what the study should look at, and there were a series of sort of comments or discussions that this group talked about. I was asked, will this identify specific housing needs at individual jurisdiction levels? And my answer to that was no. That was not something that we were intending to do. A comment that came forward is, let's understand that housing is an issue unto itself, but it also connects among many, many other issues that our region works on, and that's something that we actually have heard consistently through our stakeholder engagement process. We were asked, will a study identify how the demographics of poverty is changing over time? And that could be both the location of people that are living in poverty, but also, the aging of our population as we increase the number of people that are living on fixed incomes. How does that ultimately play out? And we identified, yes, that is something that we plan to look at. And then we did have a question that I think many communities are dealing with, but sort of this notion of the competition for land. Housing is really competing in many ways in many cases with light industrial manufacturing and commercial uses for land. Unfortunately, as we mentioned in June, that's really a context issue, and it would be really hard within our scope to look at individual places around the region that are potentially dealing with that. But that is something that is actually getting some attention in some of our catalytic and technical assistance projects that we're doing as part of our Sustainable Communities Initiative. So we are offering to do a little bit of that exercise. So we have done a lot of stakeholder engagement efforts related to the issue of housing, meeting very frequently with our local governments, with stakeholders on this issue, including the private development sector. We did a lot of work with communities that receive direct allocations from HUD. We have a dozen or so in our region that do that, mostly to make sure that we weren't in conflict. We are very new to this space. We didn't want to step on toes. We wanted to, at minimum, not be in conflict, but hopefully be very complementary of the work that those communities are already doing within this space. So we spent a lot of time, even in advance of actually beginning the work, but have continued to involve those communities along the way. So as I mentioned, a few high-level highlights of some of the stuff that's actually in the strategy document. As a region, between 1980 and 2010, we added about 1 million people, very robust growth in this region. But generally, our housing stock, sort of the relationship of single-family uses to attached uses, really didn't change all that much over that 30-year period. And we are seeing, significant declines in almost every county in the region and home ownership rates. One thing that is really interesting in this region that is unique, and in many ways we're very fortunate, our housing price and incomes have largely tracked pretty well together over the last decade or so. That is not true in many regions where they've seen housing prices go up and incomes remain pretty stagnant. The only reason in many ways that we've been able to do that is by importing high-wage workers. That's the only way we've been able to keep that up. So that in some ways is good news, but sort of the flip side of that is we've had over the last 5-10 years, we've had tens of thousands of folks slip into poverty, and they are right now facing historically high vacancy rates and rents. A lot of competition for the affordable stock that's out there. And though we've done pretty well in terms of housing costs and incomes, the cost of consumer goods have gone up. So overall, purchasing power has really been something that has taken a hit in the last decade or so. Hopefully the first bullet isn't news to anyone that's been at this board table for a while. We are going to experience significant growth in the older adult population over the next 15, 20, 30 years. What may be a little bit of a nuance there is a lot of that growth is going to occur in suburban and rural locations. And the other thing that I think sometimes people forget about is there's also a very direct link to rates of disability and older adult status and age. So we're going to see a lot of growth in the disabled population as well as people continue to age. And we also, through the data analysis for the housing work, identified a very real mismatch between the location of affordable housing and our region's primary job centers. And this was also something that was heard loud and clear in the interview processes as well. And I hope this graph works. I spent some time thinking about it, but I love it, but I don't know if it really, how well it will do with you all, and so my apologies if this fails miserably. But obviously our strategy focuses on our region. I mean, that's what's really important, is to understand the dynamics in our region, but I wanted to add these to give you a sense as to what a national perspective might look like. In some ways these were picked at random other than Dallas, and I can explain this in a second. For those that don't understand what the Case-Shiller Index does, it ultimately talks about housing prices within a region and indexes back to 2000 to understand how your housing prices have changed from 2000 going forward. And so you can see in places like San Diego and Washington, D.C., over about a 6-year period, that 150% increase in housing prices. So a very intense, acute change in the housing dynamics related to income versus places like Denver and Dallas that sort of had these sort of maybe more slower and steady increases. And the reason why Denver and Dallas are the two regions I put on here is the only two regions that Case-Shiller measures that have returned to housing prices above the peak. Everyone else is trying to catch up to the mid-2000s where they were. And so ultimately, we did not necessarily have a housing a bubble burst in our region. We let a little bit of the air out, unlike other places like San Diego and D.C. and places I didn't use like Las Vegas and Miami that really just fell off the table. And so you can see a lot of similarities between Denver and Dallas when it comes to overall housing prices and how we changed over the last decade or so. But in many ways, this is where the comparison ends, and I have a slide later on these two communities that will shed a little bit more light on that. So even though obviously we've been focusing on housing issues with the regional housing strategy, we've heard a lot about the issue of housing in our work with the economic strategy as well, really through a series of interviews with economic development professionals around the region. We heard that overall, in their minds, middle and upper skill workers have access to a great variety of housing opportunities. In many ways, that's one of the key things that makes our region competitive. There are all sorts of communities and contexts that can ultimately attract people to our region. But there's sort of a flag there when it comes to housing prices, is that there is this link between the ratio of housing prices and how much economic growth a region can expect long term. During sort of the 90s or the 2000 to 2006, during that period of really intense housing increases that I showed you, many of the regions around the country that had the highest housing prices actually lost population. And places like Denver benefited. We benefited from people from California cashing out or choosing to live here because it was more affordable than San Francisco, right? So longer term, you have to understand if we become the place that really has housing prices that become problematic, is that going to ultimately become an anchor on economic development opportunities? And as I mentioned, we heard during the interview process with our economic development partners that really this lack of rental housing options accessible to jobs is really a key issue that they're struggling with. Particularly on the business side of things, businesses are having a hard time attracting and retaining entry-level and lower-income workers, and it becomes an issue with them long-term to be able to do that. So that's sort of also a transition slide to talking about sort of the economic strategy side of things. Again, we had some help here through the HUD grant to actually hire an outside consultant to lead a lot of this work. And I lay out sort of what the key outcomes are of this work, but it kind of boils down to recognizing that as a region we have a very solid infrastructure of folks that do economic development, traditional economic development day in and day out. Business expansion, attraction, recruitment, those sorts of activities. We have no interest in being in that game. No one has any interest in us being in that game. That's a shared value that we can both agree to. But we also recognize, and this is something that I heard early in the MetroVision 2040 process that really resonated with me, is that in many ways the traditional economic development community and DRCOG are promoting the same brand. we are both promoting this place as a great place to live, a place to work, or a place to raise families, but we have different spheres of influence about how we deliver on that brand promise. So we might need to think about how to coordinate. So that's really what a lot of these activities are geared around. So this is something that actually appears in the draft version of the strategy that the staff is currently working on that frankly just tells the story about how all of these things are connected, how the idea of an economically vital region is connected to the notion of thinking through community development issues. A way to think about this as an example is obviously businesses are looking for highly skilled labor. But if you have a transportation system that can't get that labor to the source of employment, then you really have a disconnect there. You have to think about that. Same thing, I mean, having a strong workforce is really critical, obviously. But one of the things that we heard very loud and clear in our interview process is what really is something that's important to employers is once someone has the job, the ability to continue to add skills, not only skills that would be offered through the employer directly, but skills that may be offered through more of a community development perspective as well. So I will fly through these highlights of both assets and challenges that we heard during the interview process. We interviewed, I think that we conducted about a dozen or so interviews with 40 or so participants, so a really good cross-section. Many of these things are probably things you already know, so I'll just hit a few highlights. Obviously, quality of life is a big economic driver here, and it is one of the things that is attracting the 25 to 34-year-old workforce, also known oftentimes as the millennials. And I will tell you, as a Generation X person, I'm sick of hearing about the millennials. But through this process, it really spoke to me about how important they are for a variety of reasons. They're important because they send a note to the world that we have workforce to replace the boomers. If you have all boomers aging out of your workforce and don't have anybody to replace them, you're in trouble as a region. They are entering into their peak household formation years, so they become high spenders. They spend on consumer goods, housing, entertainment. They actually add a lot to the economy other than just living here. And obviously, because they're the sort of the younger folks, they bring the latest skills, technical assets, all those sorts of things, which obviously are really key drivers to the economy. Heard a lot about DIA. I think people recognize how important that airport is to our long-term future. A lot about transit investment and planning. Our focus on transit is sending a signal to the broader market that we are really interested in economic development, and we are interested in building communities around transit. As I mentioned, the housing, lifestyle, and diversity, you have many, many, many housing options in this region. You can live in a really great urban environment. You can live in a suburban setting. You can live in a rural town. There are lots of options that people can actually pursue when they get here. And then obviously we do have a really strong highway network that connects us to other parts of the country. Some of the sort of other side of the conversation, the sort of weaknesses that we heard during the interview process, we do have high housing costs for a metro area, and that is for the size of our metro area, and that is beginning to be problematic. We heard, beginnings of tales of people going to Minneapolis, Omaha to try to attract businesses, and they're like, well, we would love to come, but your housing is beginning to frighten us a little bit in terms of can we get workers to want to move there. As I mentioned, we've been fortunate that we've created a pretty strong link between housing prices and incomes, largely by importing workers. We are not doing a very good job of educating our own. The young people in our region are not getting those bachelor's degrees and advanced degrees, and if you ever run into a problem where you can no longer import workforce, this region is in pretty serious trouble. Just the third one very quickly, the traditional sort of idea of economic development was you had to have workforce, you had to have transportation, and oftentimes you had to have water. So that's a three-legged stool. It's now a four-legged chair. You have to have access to broadband. If you do not have access to high-speed internet, you're in trouble. And a lot of these other things I think are probably things that people recognize as pretty critical things as well. Some other threats that we heard, and I'm sorry this feels longer, but we did hear, trust me, this was mostly a good news conversation. We talk a lot about attracting Fortune 500 companies, and we haven't necessarily done a lot of that, but let's not lose the fact that we are actually becoming a really strong hub in both the western and west central U.S. So even if it's not the headquarters, we are getting significant operations here. Cost of power for large power users, we've heard quite a bit about that. One of the things that our economic development professionals have been able to tout for years is access to recreation in the mountains via I-70. Well, anyone that spends time on I-70s on the weekends knows that that's becoming more and more problematic. And so how do you continue to sell that access when you got to get up at 4:30 in the morning to actually beat traffic, right? And then we heard a lot, obviously there's a lot of good on the transit side of the equation, but there's some uneven things with it as well. We heard that the fare structure, particularly for light rail, is really not conducive to getting low and middle income folks to actually use transit. It's a pretty expensive trip compared to other systems of its size. And then we actually heard quite a bit about the EcoPass as well. Great option to get employers or employees to look at transit options, but it only really works in a variety of locations. In the central business district, you get about a 40% capture rate of folks that get EcoPasses and actually use alternative transportation versus more like 10% in sort of our high capacity suburban environment. So thinking of that as a model and how to encourage people to use alternative modes is something we should be thinking about. So that's sort of the stakeholder and, engagement side of things, but we've been doing some data analysis as well on this. We identified a series of indicators to kind of just measure how we're doing compared to our competitor regions so that potentially we could track that over time. What are we doing really well on? What are the things that maybe we need to work on? Understand our strengths and weaknesses, and through this process we learned that a lot of folks are doing very similar work. A lot of folks are looking at Denver and trying to figure out what's going on with us because they recognize that they're competing with us for economic investment. So through both that interview process and actually looking through data from the Metro Denver EDC, there were 6 places that just sort of bubbled to the top. This is who we compete against when it comes to relocations and expansions. It's over and over and over. It's these same 6 places: Phoenix, Dallas, Salt Lake, Austin, Atlanta, and Portland. I peppered our consultants, what about Minneapolis? What about all these other places? And it really came down to these 6 over and over and over again. So the next few slides kind of show you a few kind of sample indicators that we've been using to sort of see how we fare or how we stack up against these places. So the first one is people over the age of 25 with an advanced degree. And so just so Metro Denver, when it's like this, is always in the middle. So great news there. We actually are leading that group in terms of the percentage of our overall population that has advanced degrees. So definitely more good news than anything else. The one sort of asterisk that I would put on it is that you see down here we have a smaller, relatively, or middle of the pack portion of our younger folk that have advanced degrees. So we do have a lot of people between 25 and 44, but their level of degreedness is not the same as it is in some of our competitor regions. So it's just something to keep in mind going forward. So sort of coming back to the housing piece that I mentioned before, so this is median price of single family housing. And so basically during the recession and recovery process, we became the most expensive housing market of all of these peer regions. We trailed Portland for quite some time. Denver's the darkest blue line here. But in terms of overall single family housing price, we became the most expensive region. And the reason I wanted to mention that I would come back to sort of the Dallas comparison, there's $100,000 that separates the median single family house price in Dallas from Denver. And Dallas is the community that is our second most, that we compete the most against Phoenix and the second most against Dallas. And so both of those places can point to $100,000 plus difference in median housing price, and that means something to communities or to businesses that are looking to move their workers here. That's a pretty big deal. The one thing I would note that is that when you bring income into it, Portland is slightly still a little bit more expensive than we are, but they're so close to each other that we're ultimately kind of tied for the most expensive, and by quite a fair margin, I'd say. So housing cost is important, but also transportation, sort of the overall impact on household budgets, because again, that impacts purchasing power, people's ability to buy goods that are ultimately taxed that, of course, buoy our revenue to be able to provide services to these folks. So not surprisingly, again, Metro Denver in the middle, highest on the housing side of things. So not the best news there, but the good news is we're doing really well on transportation. In terms of the overall budget associated with transportation costs, we actually have the lowest impact on each household's budget, or the average household's budget. So obviously you need to think of these things in concert. We want to think about housing, but we need to be thinking about transportation at the same time as well. And another one that came up, as I mentioned, sort of DIA and all of our airports actually, but really that access to other places in the country via air as well as international markets as well. And so you can see here Denver in the middle again, ranking third of the six, but certainly there's a huge separation between Atlanta, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Denver and everybody else in terms of nonstop domestic and international flights. So we're certainly in the upper tier there, which is good news. And again, a pretty wide margin between the top three and the bottom four. So a few other things to just sort of mention from that work. In terms of business costs, things like rent, utilities, we actually are the most expensive market for business costs. We had the second highest population growth of those peer regions, about 8.5% increase between 2007 and 2012. Austin somehow hit 15%, which I thought was insane. I could not believe that they grew that much in just a 6-year period. And cost of living, that's housing, that's everything. We actually are the second most expensive place to live, only after Portland in that case. And so some other things that we did in both the economic strategy work and the housing strategy work, because I think it's important for staff to recognize this, but also particularly if these ad hoc groups are something that's supported here, what are some of our peer agencies doing? How are other folks thinking about this issue? And one of the things that became very clear is that many COGs and MPOs that we consider peer agencies are looking at both of these issues. They're doing things like best practice toolkits and resource guides. They really are taking the data and creating and developing data, but also distributing the data so that people can make really informed decisions. Some are even doing direct technical assistance with local communities. As I mentioned, a lot of folks are doing very similar work on the economic benchmarking, just to have an idea of how you're doing compared to your competitors, so you can both troubleshoot and celebrate the things that you're doing well. And a lot of them are really kind of where we are, is that they've had pretty traditional regional plans that focus on transportation, growth and development, and environment issues, but they've also identified these two things as really critical things that we probably should be thinking about, and they're trying to figure out how to integrate those into a larger regional planning framework. So that was my spiel, but to remind you of what tonight's action is, staff is asking for this group to recommend to the board, 2 ad hoc groups, to spend a little bit more time on these issues. There's lots of information. There's lots of data. We really do want the board and to really help us create this policy framework. This is new territory for us. This is something that I really think the board needs to lead on. This is not something that I would really feel comfortable as staff bringing forward to the board. I really want the board to feel comfortable and to be leaders on this, and to really give us direction as to really what's the right spot for this organization, considering where we are on these issues that are in front of us today. And that's it for me.
Questions? Mr. Tisdale.
I think one thing that's worthy of highlighting here is that the information that's been presented to us by Brad at this time is not here for adoption or approval this afternoon, but rather to demonstrate that these ad hoc groups or the committees will have the benefit of a great deal of work that's already been done and input that's already been received, and hence there is no need to have those other outside parties a part of these ad hoc groups. And so the word board actually modifies both members and alternates. In other words, these are board members and board alternates that we would be appointing to these ad hoc groups. And I think that's worthy of emphasizing to avoid any potential confusion. I'm sure there isn't, but in case there were. And that we do have this really significant amount of work that's already gone into it. So I would move to recommend to the board that we establish the 2 ad hoc groups of board members and board alternates to integrate both housing and economic vitality into MetroVision 2040.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Further discussion? Phil.
Just a question, Brad. What kind of time frame do you see these ad hoc groups needing to meet and come back with a report that's going to be valuable in the context of MetroVision 2040?
So, our schedule largely dictates that, and we do have some flexibility, but we would like this work to be wrapped up by the end of the year. Obviously, I think we can really probably knock this out in probably 3 meetings or so of each group. That's probably me being naive. I mean, who knows? But I'm really thinking, August, September, October as being kind of the heavy lift months. Maybe going into to November potentially, but I would love to be really wrapped up by mid-November so that we can spend some time, really formulating the policy and obviously getting it as tight as possible so that it really does represent what those groups want to recommend to the board for further consideration.
Thank you.
Great. Anthony and then Herb.
Just to speak briefly in support of this motion, housing is increasingly important to Mayor Hancock as a strategic priority. There are a couple of things that he's got the administration working on very squarely. First, something he's calling his 3x5 initiative. He's interested in building 3,000 affordable units within a 5-year period. We've been tracking these trends very carefully and recognize that we've all got to get on board with this. The second thing is we actually have an affordable housing summit that we're trying to put in the works right now that we're going to be reaching out to our regional partners about because we want to continue this dialogue. We think DRCOG has really been an excellent leader in this regard, really tackling many of these conversations and continuing on. But Denver is fully supportive of this measure, and I'd be happy to volunteer for the 2 committees.
Great. Herb?
And kind of follow up with what Phil and some of us have been involved in, but especially from the housing side, from the Metro Mayor's Caucus and other groups, we spent an inordinate amount of time working through that issue down to the state legislature this last year. So in conjunction with what staff's saying, I think at least in that area we have a ton of information that we were trying to present to the legislature this last year that's already there. So that one may not be as much issue. Economic vitality, I think, is going to be a little bit more work to it than the housing side.
Other comments? Ron?
When would be the appropriate time to take issue with some of the conclusions shown in the report, which I think are seriously flawed?
I think in the committee, so it sounds like you might be volunteering.
Yeah, I'd like to, but unfortunately I have to balance time commitments, and I would remind you all that your first commitment is to those who took you to the dance, your cities.
Other comments? Bill?
One thing that I see missing from this report is an analysis of the potential core industries, our strengths, aerospace, our resource industries, as well as our energy and energy development industries. Was that purposely left out, or?
When it comes to sort of what I would call the economic development side of the house, there's some turf issues that we were trying to be aware of. There are sort of, the Metro Denver EDC has their 8 key sectors that really they're looking to attract to our region, and we did not want to give the impression that we are going to look at that in any way to sort of bring any attention to it. Those are accepted. There's probably some things that we could do specifically to kind of understand more from maybe the labor and housing side of things, and even sort of where the locational opportunities are with those sectors. That we've done a little bit of that, but it was not something that we wanted to focus on because we were treading lightly on the work that other entities are working on.
You just don't want to piss off Tom. Huh?
There you go.
Jackie?
I would encourage us to take into consideration really including what is the role for DRCOG in both of these. We went through a process identifying our mission and vision and what it is that we are trying to achieve and accomplish as an organization. So there's many important things that could be done in both of these arenas, and I think what we also need to keep our focus on is what DRCOG should be doing, and I assume that's going to be part of the discussion with the ADCOG group and that policy recommendation back to the full board.
Absolutely. I am a very big believer on how this impacts our work program and what we do. And so everything that we've done has ultimately had recommendations about what our role is. But the thing that I think is missing right now is the policy framework that tells us it's important, right? It's important to us. It's important to this board. Therefore, we should be working on it, and we should be doing these things. And so the groups that will form will talk about all of those things to ultimately come up with both the policy framework and really an outline of what do we do to actually work as a region to implement the things that we've said are important to us on these issues, as well as all the other things that are in MetroVision.
Just one follow-up question. Would that include workforce development?
Potentially, we could at least talk about it. I mean,
because I think that's essential to this process.
We do have some of our peer agencies are also the regional workforce investment board, so they have a mandated role. We don't have that per se, but there could be some things that when it comes to workforce we look at. It may not be workforce development. It may be simply access to workforce centers. It may be access to employment. There could be something that really, there is a nexus between what is more of a traditional role for DRCOG and that issue.
Robin?
Thanks. I just wanted to also chime in support of the motion and to a couple of the questions about the report or the board's role. I mean, I think that was really before I was an elected official and a member of this body, or an alternate but a member of this body, the MVIC. I participated in some of the sustainable communities grant drafting because of my work in TOD and particularly housing, and I think it is compelling how many regions have easily drawn the dot between their work on transportation and land use to these issues. And so I don't think that we need to look at these as paths away from our mission. I really do think they're very close ties. And the example I always explain to my constituents, when they ask about this stuff is, think about the person miles traveled or the vehicle miles traveled that people travel to get to housing they can afford, right? If you care about congestion, you got to care about housing prices because the two are related. If you want to think about, so for me, I think that this is a great opportunity to find those connects and to describe them. And, the data is the data, but then there's, I don't think we have to get drawn into some of the framing of those data or the conclusions that were so divisive in the board conversation. I was not there, but, having kind of looked through the discussion after the fact. So I feel like we've got to learn from the data that we can, and we can draw our own conclusions about what that means for us in terms of thinking about our transportation investments or our land use things. The transit build out and all of the other types of investments that the region is making and that this body blesses or talks about, or even, sometimes just goes back and influences in our other circles. So I see it as a great opportunity and one that we can easily follow. And in this case, I know we're a strong region, we have the compact, but if we don't keep innovating, we won't be the leading edge anymore. And in this area, I would say we're already not. Most of the other regions are doing something in their regional plans about this, and it gets the attention and sometimes some dollars from the feds, just like the grant got for us. I mean, we would not, if we weren't looking at these things and if we hadn't said we were willing to look at them, we would have millions less for the catalytic projects and some of the planning that we've done along the region. So I think it's a great opportunity to really tie things together and not take us away.
Hopeful comments. Jennifer reminds me that the time to volunteer will be if and when the board actually decides to move forward with this. So Anthony, thank you for your enthusiasm and early at that, but we'll have to wait for that before we solicit names. So any final comments? Are we ready to, Phil, you get the last comment and then we'll vote?
Well, it's just a comment in support. Herb mentioned certainly in dealing with the housing issue on a current committee within the Metro Mayors. Last year transportation was a big part in the funding component. So in addition to all of the data that's there, there's more even data that can be brought, and certainly transportation, both what gets funded through DRCOG as well as transportation that might not get funded through DRCOG is certainly important for economics and our economic vitality as a region.
Well said. All right. We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes unanimously. So now we are on to our last item. It's an informational item on the managed lanes policy discussion.
Okay.
At last November's MVIC meeting, who was here for last November's MVIC meeting? I know Elise was. At last November's meeting, staff was directed to do some research and provide information to the MVIC committee regarding toll-managed lanes, HOV access rules, income equity related to the users of these facilities. And so we've conducted a lot of research, and I'm here today to give a quick synopsis of the research that we've conducted regarding managed lanes. First, though, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page when we throw out this term toll managed lanes or managed lanes, and just go through a couple examples to make sure we're understanding and talking about the same thing. First off, there are many types and different types of facilities. Of course, here in the Denver region, we probably have the greatest variety of types of managed lanes as in any metro area around the country. You know, we have toll express lanes that basically operate 24/7, North I-25, US 36, the future US 36. Some are in one direction per peak period. Others are both directions all day long or coming up in the future. So that's one type. We have peak hour shoulder use that's been proposed in the I-70 mountain corridor on specific locations. Nothing final there yet, but it's been talked about quite a bit. We have HOV, which is high occupancy vehicle, which basically means cars or trucks with 2 or more people in them, or transit vehicles. We have HOV only facilities that operate just in the peak periods. So Phil down in Littleton on Santa Fe Drive, if you're coming up in the morning with a passenger or going down in the afternoon with a passenger, those are the specific times. And no mannequins, okay. We have ones that are bus-only facilities and only during the peak period. Look out our door here on Lincoln and Broadway. That's another flavor. In the future, we may have more, I mean, who knows, in Salt Lake City, they've got HOV-only facilities that operate 24/7, just for HOV vehicles with no tolling, nothing like that. Any type of managed lane, what it really implies is that there's some sort of variation in rules or cost or whatever compared to the general purpose lanes next to it. So if you're heading up North I-25 after this meeting, there's going to be people in the general purpose lanes, and then there's also the toll express lanes. And it's a choice of whether you want to use those or not. You can pay a toll if you're just one person in a car and use that, or if you're a carpool, currently you can use that lane for free. In 2 more years, you may have to be a 3+ person carpool to use that for free. So there can be price variation, time of day differences in the operation, but either way there's some choice involved between the general purpose lane and the toll or managed lane facility. And it's all about managing the flow of traffic in that facility. You know, it's keeping the traffic moving in that managed lane. Pricing it the right way if tolls are involved, to price it high enough so that it doesn't fill up with vehicles. You want to keep that traffic moving, keep the buses moving that are in it. So there's special agreements that are set in place with RTD and CDOT right now on the North I-25 facility. If congestion gets so bad that the buses are delayed a certain amount on average trip or number of times per month, then the prices have to be adjusted to make sure that that facility doesn't get too busy. Pictures of some of the ones around the area, the North I-25 facility. We've got the Santa Fe Drive one for those of you in the Southwest. The C-470 proposal that'll be under construction soon, of initially at least adding toll express lanes near the median. I-70 mountain corridor, some proposals were looked at a couple years ago. They're being looked at right now in a study that's going on there right now. The future US 36 corridor that's going to go all the way to Boulder, that's those of you that head up that way, whether in a bus or driving your own car, that's what it's going to look like. In at least the first section will open up next year, and then another year for the complete section. This is one in Salt Lake City where it's just divided by the striping there, and it's purely for HOVs. There's no tolling involved, nothing like that. It's just HOVs. So we did a lot of research on toll-managed lanes. There's dozens, probably hundreds of studies or analyses, papers that have been written of this topic, a wide range of results, often drawing different conclusions. Hard to believe that. But overall, in all of them, it's hard to come up with real definitive conclusions, at least in a policy setting standpoint. There's some certain assumptions that are obvious in any type of facility, and we'll talk about those. But it's really tough to come up with conclusive arguments to set a policy this way or set a policy another way. Some of these studies, the quality or objectivity is questionable. You have authors writing counter articles against others, so it's not an easy one. So first, let's look at a couple of types of policy type issues. Some are going to be pretty obvious, and some might not really be a policy issue, but just a real fact that you don't need a study to tell you. If there's free use of carpools in a tolled HOV lane or a toll express lane, whatever we want to call it, a managed toll lane, that will decrease the overall revenues. I mean, that's simple math. If there's free people on there, that's going to be less revenues coming in for that facility related to paying for the maintenance and operation or paying off bonds if bonds were needed to construct that facility. Therefore, tolls would have to be raised to cover that. It's like the plane you get on for a trip. If it wasn't for the first class passengers paying that much, we'd all pay more. So we have to thank them. The free use by carpools or some variation of that, that's going to require some type of enforcement, some type of costs associated with that. Equipment to do the monitoring, police, law enforcement. Usually those costs are going to be embedded within the tolls because it has to be covered. Looked at one study that looked at, well, what about the fines that are levied by the local police department? So will that offset the costs? Studies concluded really not, and part of that is that in most instances those fines don't go back to the operator, they stay within the city. So it's not like the city police are out there and they give you a ticket and then say, oh, here you go, CDOT, here's the money we got from that, or HPTE, High Performance Tolling Enterprise. That money stays just within the city coffers. Other impacts on toll managed lanes, go to the next one here, if HOVs have the free access, we know, existing carpools, if you offer the free access to the managed toll lanes, existing carpools are going to divert from other general purpose lanes right next door, or maybe from other parallel facilities, and they'll use the managed lanes. And that's great. Some new carpools will form. Studies were across the board on this, but generally it's a pretty small amount of new carpools that will actually form from previous single occupant vehicle trips. Some will come from transit. There will be a small amount that will form, but it's relatively small, but it's an important amount. Likewise, if we have the opposite occur of changing a policy, I'll call midstream, and that's a situation that's going to be on US 36 and North I-25 in a couple of years. They did a plan amendment 2 years ago noting that currently any carpool there gets a free pass going up North I-25 and US 36, no matter what the size. Starting at the latest in January of 2017, it's going to switch to only 3 or more carpools can use that for free. So if you're in a 2-person carpool, you'll pay whatever the toll is at that time of day. Now remember, for 80% of the time, the toll up there is going to be very little. It's only during the peak hours when the toll goes up to, whatever the amount will be. I don't know how many dollars it'll be to use that facility. So because of that, of course, you can have some two-person carpools that will move over to the general purpose lanes. They just decide we're not going to pay the toll, or the traffic isn't that bad. We'll move over to those lanes. You'll have some that'll stay in the toll lane, two-person carpool, and they'll, in essence, split the cost. Some of those two-person carpools will try to attract a third person so they can use that toll managed lane for free. So they'll go out and recruit and maybe work with our Way to Go program here and try to find an additional carpooler. Some of them will divert back to being a single occupant vehicle driver. For whatever, they just don't want to pay that toll, and they'll divert. A study that was done a couple years ago associated with this plan amendment for US 36 and I-25 that proposed this shift said maybe 1 or 2% of the previous HOV carpools would move back to being a single occupant vehicle driver. A tough one to predict. There's all these fancy models that try to do it, but that was the rough estimate in that study. And some carpoolers that were previously in that two-person carpool that don't want to pay the toll, they'll switch to transit. Transit is pointed out in a lot of the studies, and that's probably one of the consistent things, as being a real key to the toll managed lanes. If you've got good transit service there, so US 36 is a great example, and with the BRT, the extra BRT treatments and work that they're going to be doing with stations, that's a really good thing. I mean, that's where you get a lot of the bang for the buck, and that was one thing that was consistent among the studies. Another issue that has come up here and around the country is concerns about the income equity of the users of these facilities. You've heard the terms Lexus lanes and things like that. Looked at a lot of studies on this. They run across the board of saying it's not an issue, it is an issue. A wide range of what I'll say is quality of studies, but some general conclusions and thoughts that came out of reading these is, people of all incomes, both drivers, passengers, whether you're a carpool passenger or a transit passenger, are using these facilities. So basically all incomes are covered, for different types of trips or emergency trips, or you have to get the daycare before it closes, and there's heavy traffic in the general purpose lanes. Everybody is using these. Yes, though, there is a greater share of higher income users of these types of facilities, such as the North I-25 express lanes, a greater share of higher income users compared to the income share for the total population of the region. Now, that's how some of these studies have been done. They've been comparing the users of the facility to the population at large. We do note that you got to be a little bit careful there in some of these studies, that you really, to have a really solid study, you need to look at the users of that whole corridor up there and not compare it to the entire region. But as with anything that has a cost, it has a greater share of higher income users. What's been suggested is potentially offering rebates or vouchers to lower income persons for using these facilities, the toll managed lanes. Obviously there's going to be some cost to that. Just read about some issues back east where they do something similar to this in Staten Island on the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, where there you're an island and it's only one way on and off. And the governor there recently proposed, and I think it passed, offering discounts on the toll to the Staten Island residents. Now, I was kind of amazed that the actual discount is 86 cents per trip, from like $6.50 for the round trip to go on the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, that if you're a resident of Staten Island, it's going to go from $6.50 down to like $5.80. And But it was a very big issue. As soon as that came up, next week in the paper, folks up in Westchester County with the Tappan Zee Bridge in Rockland County up the Hudson said, well, wait a minute, we want a discount too for going over the Tappan Zee Bridge. And that one I do not know yet. So there's potentially ways of lessening if it truly is an impact. The fourth yellow bullet there is we note, of course, that people can always use the general purpose lanes for free. And currently all of the proposals in our region around here is that there will be general purpose lanes next to the toll managed lanes. And so there will be less congestion after the toll lanes are added. Yes, more traffic will come there over time, but all users benefit. The key thing with when the widenings would occur is that there would be less duration and less severity of congestion. As we know with any widening project, rarely eliminates congestion. But when we do our measurements, there truly is less duration in terms of how long it lasts and less severity just in terms of the magnitude of that congestion. I guess that was my last informational one. Conclusion is over. Is that the studies are inconclusive. This is just a sample list of some of the ones that we looked at. A lot of different issues out there. Different MPOs play different roles in this. Some cities or states are toll facility or managed lane heavy. If you go down to Dallas, it's a huge money maker down there. The toll revenues there fund other projects. The toll revenues there fund sustainability projects that are administered. I think they fund MPO staff on some of it. So every city region is different. You have the more long-standing toll places back east. If you're on Chicago with the Tri-State Tollway, or New York or New Jersey, those have been there 50, 60 years. So a wide range. And with that, I guess I'll just ask if there's any questions or discussion, next steps, or...
Robin?
Thank you. Steve, that was a really helpful start, but I had a couple questions that I didn't see in there, and I would have thought I might have, so maybe they just wasn't available. Or, but I guess how many people use HOV when it's available? Is there, any data from our own experience in Colorado or elsewhere? Secondly, you talked about a lot of the downsides. I'm just curious if the studies discussed benefits. For example, if you translate the number of folks who use it to air quality, for example, I'm not quite sure why anyone would do it from the presentation, so I just didn't know if there were some benefits that we didn't talk about. And then lastly, I was just curious, since we do have a high-performance tolling enterprise here in Colorado, whether or not we kind of ran these conclusions by those folks in terms of whether it gels with, would they agree with those conclusions or those?
Well, I purposely didn't draw conclusions.
Okay. Well, some of the, like, if you do this, this will occur.
Right.
For example, if you can go back to the slide where it talked about what would happen if you allow users for free. I forget what your wording was, but, yeah, tolls must be raised. I actually asked this question to the financing people for HPT the other day because as we get into the I-70 conversation, I did not want to be in the boat of learning too late that, we built the financing model around something and now we can't do it. And I asked the question, and the answer was, yes, you do need to know in advance if you're doing HOV or not. But the word was like negligible in terms of impact to the finance. It was not, he didn't describe it as a significant. Every road is different, every project's different. The tolls on I-70 are not expected to create what they will on 470. So, but I just was curious whether or not that statement, which seems pretty definitive, is something that is always true, sometimes true, or maybe still do. Because it's kind of definitive there. So those are the three questions that I had.
Should I'm happy to respond, or do you want me to?
Well, if you know the answers now, sure. Otherwise,
just a couple of quick ones on the quote benefit piece. The one key thing that didn't talk about at all here is is simply helping to pay for projects. You know, so the monetary piece to help pay for the facility, for helping in the bonding process of knowing, you know, the bond people. Sorry, I don't know the official terms. You know, want to see that there's going to be a stream of money coming in over time, and that is what the tolls will provide. And so it helps with the funding of transportation projects that might not be able to be funded otherwise, or as one study I looked at yesterday said that that's one of the key, another benefit of the tolling, and partially eye to the beholder, is that it means you don't have to use other general fund or sales tax, or more appropriately gas tax money. You don't have to use as much gas tax money, which is very regressive, to pay for the improvements or the widenings on that. So that's one piece. Is I didn't mention in here that it brings in money to help pay for some projects. On this one, and it's not as much that tolls would suddenly be raised, but just in a economic, mathematical sense, if there's fewer entities paying into something, then those other entities there, you know, may have to pay more if they're taking up that space. I mean, that's now it'll range extremely.
Depends on the number of users, right? I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. Whether or not there's any data.
A wide range of data.
Right.
There's tons that I can pull from.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think that it depends. I think that to me, when I asked this to HDPE and he says, you know, may not have any impact, and yet here it says tolls must be raised. I mean, maybe if the whole project's being paid for with tolls, or a portion, if you're expecting 25% of the users to be HOV versus less than 5, it just seems to me there's a lot of contingencies, and this is a pretty broad statement, and it's a pretty important statement, which is why I feel like it's concerning me that it's pretty unqualified. So,
Jennifer, do you wanted to respond to that? And then
yeah, well, I just want to say that you talked to HPTE, and I certainly get that they're the group that's here and that we'll be working with when we do these kinds of projects. This report is based on not only what's going on here, but what's going on nationwide, and I think the big conclusion here is that no two toll roads are created equal. So what works or what may happen on one is not at all what's going to happen on another one, just because the way it was put together, the way it's being used by the folks that are on it, and that sort of thing. So, you know, I think that too is why CDOT and HPTE have come up with such a with the policy that they've come up with, which is we'll look at it, and if we don't do it, we'll explain why we don't think it would work. Because even here in Colorado, we've got this whole big mishmash of how we do these kinds of facilities. So even with this, we can't do an apples-to-apples comparison of what we're doing here and how it works and why it works the way it does. So our conclusion, based on the research that we've done up to this point, that Steve has presented at least, is that it's no two toll roads are created equal.
And one thing to put in any of these things up here, it all assumes all else being equal in terms of comparing like a before and now. All else being equal, nothing else changing. If you have 100 cars and it's 80 and 20, and now you have 100 cars but it's 90 and 10, all else being equal, it's going to mean if you're trying to get a set amount of money, if you're determined to get a set amount of money to pay off bonds or whatever, you would have to take in a little bit more of money from those other users. So,
Jackie, and then Phil.
Actually, I was going to echo, or I was going to say what Jennifer just said, which is why it is a complicated issue. It's a quarter by quarter issue, and why I think in their great wisdom, our transportation commissioners have said there is not one size fits all for this, and each quarter needs to look at it independently and make the evaluation that works and the decision that makes sense and works for that quarter. So I just want to echo those comments.
Phil?
Yeah. Steve, though you said you didn't make any conclusions, I think you did make at least one summary, which says if you add a lane, whether it's free or not free, whether it's tolled or not tolled. Directionally, it positively impacts severity and duration of congestion.
Mm-hmm. Wait, yeah.
Less.
Improves.
Right, improves. Okay.
All else being equal.
Yes.
All else being equal.
All else being equal. And the aspect, just to echo what Jackie has, but talking with folks that are in Europe that have dealt with a lot of this even more. Jennifer mentioned about the database in the United States. Worldwide, there's even a broader database. And for those folks that are involved in the financing, they're the ones that are taking on the behavioral risk of what is going to be happening. And I will tell you that their models are pretty sophisticated. Whether they're going to be exact, no one knows, because that's part of the definition of risk. But what they will also be looking at is not just the road and whether you have 100 cars continuing one or the other, but what are alternate or parallel routes that folks might travel, and how does that impact it. And certainly if you move to a tolling all lanes, that starts to become an important assumption or important variable to deal with. So that's why it's corridor by corridor and route by route in taking a look at this, because there is never all other things being equal. We don't end up with a very simple environment in what we're dealing with. But thanks for the information, for sure.
And this is another thing that I didn't say well enough in the beginning, is this is for the addition of lanes where there will always be, I mean, in the examples here, where there will always be general purpose and let's just call them toll express. So this is not E470, where it's 100% tolled 24/7. This is if you add capacity, and that capacity is some sort of toll express. So, you bet. It's many things.
Chairwoman's prerogative. I'm going to make a comment, and then I see Ron also has his hand up. I guess I was looking. I think I was one of the ones asking for this analysis way back when. Given that we're talking about an investment of tax dollars, I guess I was looking for impacts on some of the policy goals that we have set regionally through MetroVision, and whether or not, how does the use of HOV lanes help or detract from reaching some of those goals. I'm thinking we have transportation goals around reducing single occupancy vehicles, reducing vehicle miles traveled, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, we have a shortage of transportation dollars, so we tend to focus on financing transportation projects, but at the end of the day, we're about mobility and achieving these regional goals. Yes, we have to figure out how to pay for it, but really the outcome that we're looking for are these goals. And I guess I didn't really hear on whether or not having an HOV policy will help us achieve those goals, or maybe get in the way of that. And I think it is possible to have an HOV policy that allows for quarter variation. I think that CDOT's policy on that is, it's sort of a default policy. Look to do this if you can, and if you can't, explain why. But at least you give it a good, solid analysis. So anyway, I was looking for some of those, and I don't know if that data was available in any of the studies you were looking at, but I would love to hear more about those policy goals.
It would take a pretty big effort to do that. The results are across the board. They don't link, in the ones I've read and we looked at, they don't link real good to some of our policies we have in terms of like HOV increasing, reducing SOV. They're across the board. We could do, if we did an analysis here, we would have to use our travel model and do special runs of that, and I can't commit in terms of what level of work we would want to put in that, but that would be needed, and it would be a lot of work.
We have Ron and then Doug.
Steve, point that you made about fines staying in the general fund and not going to CDOT, as Mayor Hancock, Mayor Cernanek, and Mayor Noon and myself will attest, we write nice checks every month to pay for all the lighting and light poles on state highways, which is a significant amount of money, as particularly my dear friend from Littleton will tell about what they've had to pay out for poles that have fallen down. And so there is some offset there. It's not like cities are being greedy and keeping all the money. In fact, it's kind of the other way around. We're the ones that are
didn't mean
stuck.
at all to imply
But you said it.
I didn't mean to imply greediness. I mean, that is, I hope I didn't.
Doug?
I think in response to the chair's question, what I draw from this that Steve has shared with us is that literally you could probably find a study to support any proposition that you choose to make in the area of tolling and its impact on X. Fill in the X with whatever issue you may have, and it sounds as though there's probably a study that would support that proposition, and there's probably a study that would defeat or at least oppose that proposition. And it's one of those things where unfortunately it's the bane of modern science that is so often funded science, that we don't have pure research on these things, but rather someone promoting an agenda. And it is difficult. And the question is whether someone like us, hopefully acting without an agenda, can ultimately produce data that would answer those questions legitimately. But right now, at least from what I hear, and I recognize that this is sort of the tip of the iceberg that has been shared with us, the conclusion appears to be, if you want to take a position, you can probably find a study that will support it.
Sue?
So on that, however, while I get that studies are all over the board on all this, as we move forward with not just our vision, which has not been easy, but nonetheless, vision, and then how you achieve your vision is even more complicated. As we get into the how you achieve your vision part, we will have to have some forecasts on what impact various activities might have on the achievement of that vision, and we will have to have some method of follow-up measurement. So it may not be available right now, it may take a lot of time right now, but that's just something to keep in mind, because I don't see us making very valid decisions unless we've got some information that would support that taking this action, whether it's HOV lanes or something else, will have some impact on whatever that goal is, air quality or whatever.
Shakti and then Kathy.
I would say, I mean, I think perhaps in looking at most things, you could find studies that support both sides of them, but that doesn't mean that there's not reliable data out there. And I mean, I think anything we could produce would be meaningful, but I'm sure there are other entities that seem neutral or believable that we could also look at what they have. And I would echo what Sue said, that this seems like a fundamental enough issue that we need to understand it. So,
Kathy?
I don't know that we're going to be able to really get to a conclusion with all the time and all the money that we're going to spend on staff time to do this. Those of us that are out looking at this on a project right now, the fact that you went from 2 to 3 at the state legislature, we haven't even figured out how that's going to work yet. And what we're hearing is the enforcement for that is so difficult. And the biggest difference from a number of these are also whether you have, once you get in the lane, like I-25, you're stuck, or if you're doing an open access, the enforcement for that is much, much more. I think what we need to realize is that we make a policy, but the bondholders are the folks who are taking the risk. And if the risk of leakage is higher, they're going to charge us more. And so every project we do will cost more, and therefore the tolls will be higher for all of us that drive on it. So what did we really accomplish? My guess is they've got those models. The folks that are loaning, I mean, if you go to E470, and I'm sure Bill and Ron can tell you, that's a dedicated toll road, and they're still, have a tremendous amount of leakage on there, and that's not even an HOV. So I'm sure the bondholders built that into their model to help pay things off. And I cannot support a one-size-fits-all or a policy that says we have a policy except when we want to change it. That's my pet peeve here, is we have a policy till we change it. So I don't want to put something in writing that makes bondholders uncomfortable and not willing to come in and give us decent rates for when we go out for these projects.
Other final comments? Jennifer.
Well, I'd just like to ask the question, I mean, is there any further work that you want of staff? Because as Steve has pointed out, this takes time, money, and people to do more in-depth study, and we would need to understand what precisely it is that you're looking for in the way of that, so that we can think about what the budget looks like for that. And I have a feeling we would need to make some adjustments, mostly because we're still working on the TIP, we're still working on the regional plan, we're still working on the 2040 plan. We've still got lots of stuff in progress, at least through the end of the year, and some of these things go on through probably the second quarter of 2015. So if there's something specific you'd like staff to work on or come back with, I need a little bit more from you all.
I see Robin, and then Phil, and then Beth.
So I don't think this is on fire urgent, that it has to be done before we finish. I think we've got some work to do on, what cycle 2 of the TIP looks like and things like that. So I'm fine with waiting. And Sue, I think, summed it up. I think one thing that was hard for me is when I said what are the benefits for HOV, what I got was the answer was benefits for managed lanes. I think that the request was not to do an analysis of managed lanes. It was to do an analysis of HOV. And I think that, so there's some mushiness already that got lost there. And so what I did not hear is, why would anyone do HOV? There are reasons or benefits, and I didn't learn about them today. So for me, even if it's just 2 more slides that say, here are the downsides of HOV that you covered, what are the plus sides? Why would anyone ever do it? What's the reasoning? And I ask this with sincerity, not so much just about a board, and I didn't support trying to retroactively make C470 do something, because you were really far down a road, and I get that. But for me, I can't imagine that we wouldn't, as a body, want to be educated on that before the next big thing comes up, whether it's, my own I-70 project, our I-70 project, right? But or whatever the next big project is, capacity expansion project. So to me, I'm not quite ready to say that I feel like I'm educated yet, because what I didn't hear was the other side of the formula. Doesn't mean that these things aren't all true, but there's some reason why somebody, what are the policy outcomes that folks are aiming for? Is it air quality? Is it vehicle, single occupancy vehicles? What did people aim for, and how did it go, and why? And so that piece is still missing to me, and it's not about necessarily travel demand. I think it's fine to use secondary sources. So I want a few other slides that tell me the other piece of the story. And then from there, I think the conversation is about being educated and doing it before a project comes up, because that to me will not be good, right? I don't think it was great that you guys, from C470 felt like it came up at the end for you. And so I don't know what that looks like, but it looks like something less expensive than what Steve described, but a few more pieces of information that we didn't get today. And it's sometime, between when we finish the TIP and we end up in another TIP cycle. We tend to have some time on our hands in between. So that to me would be a way to kind of do this. And again, I don't think it's aiming towards a policy. I still don't even have enough information yet on the tool or the you know, the feature, whatever you want to call it. So, and for me, I do want to clarify. I don't think it's about tolling. I think it's about HOV. That the question that I believe that this board posed. So, clarifying.
Okay, we had Phil, then we had Beth, and then we have 5 minutes left. So.
Okay. And Jennifer, to answer your question, the piece that I would look for is there are some projects that Steve mentioned that have not yet been implemented. What we have is the opportunity to have measures before and after to see whether an impact does happen and to see that those measures are there. I'm not sure that is a large amount of action on DRCOG's staff, since those are state highways, but to see that those measures are going to be in place. I guess I'm kind of presuming that, you know, MAP 21, as long as we're using some level of federal dollars, there's going to be a lot of hooks on that, and we'll see a lot more in the way of measures and impact results. But to see that we can see those, and that I also think you could probably, without doing a lot of work and possibly closer to the time frame that Robin's looking at, I will tell you that the HOV lane on Santa Fe is largely in question because there is about a 0 assurance of compliance on that during those time frames. But it does have some marginal impact on change in behavior, in that there are some folks that actually will have someone else in the car with them. So it's marginal, but I will tell you that compliance has given up on that just because of the level of congestion and trying to even verify that there's one other person in the car. So I will just make that statement out there that you know, there's a lot of opportunities for measuring change in behavior, but I will put a question mark on whether anything lasts forever.
On that note, Beth, I think you had your hand up.
I just had a question. So is the goal today for this group to actually vote on moving forward with this, or just was this strictly informational? Because if it's strictly informational, even though I came in late, which I apologize, I would suggest that there isn't enough information yet to be able to make any determinations. And I definitely don't think that from the discussion here, I tend to agree that there wasn't enough information, well-rounded information, that we have the opportunity to get that. But this may not be something that this group can actually even move forward with or suggest to move forward with due to the time and the cost. This year, it might need to wait until after some of these other projects have actually been put forward and there's actual data from what's happening with those projects to be able to input into this. It's my understanding with the E470 group, from what we've been told as our council, that they're trying to figure out how they're going to get those people who don't pay, because there are a lot of people who don't pay. And they're trying to figure out how to do that. So that's the same problem with these toll roads as well. And enforcement, none of the communities have enough officers to be able to enforce things. And the Regional Transportation District and some of these other private companies that are doing things, I'm not exactly sure how they're enforcing it. But I very rarely see people getting stopped. So I just think that listening to the conversation here today, there's a lot more information and better balanced, well-rounded information with more data that should be provided to the group based on some of the projects that are in process now, and that would probably be more benefit to the group and the board.
So I was going to put in the last comment so we can finish. We have 1 minute and 30 seconds. Jennifer, did you?
I'll just be very quickly. I'll say that I went back and listened to the tape. It's been probably 6 or 8 weeks since I did that. I do think that we responded to what you asked for, but we're happy to go back and do as you've asked, Robin, if that's the pleasure of the rest of the group, to get some more information on the pros of HOVs and what the policy outcomes were that they were trying to attend to, and what their success or failure, hopefully not, was, and bring that back to you. I don't think that that'll be a whole lot more work In fact, Steve probably has gathered a lot of that in the research that that he's done.
That's the problem.
Yeah, it's a big pile of paper.
Well, I'll just close, and I actually agree with Robin's comments. To the degree that I had any of my comments directed this, it was to focus on the HOV piece of it specifically. So getting a little bit better sense on that piece of it would be helpful. But the timing is right. There's not a sense of urgency, and I don't think there's a desire to drive a huge price tag either. But just to better educate ourselves as we move forward, because we're going to have more of these projects come up. So with that, I'd like to close the meeting, unless there's any other final announcements. Thank you very much.
If you need a parking validation slip, come and see me. Yes, if you wouldn't mind, please take your nameplate out with you.